we go to the main story. And it is a story that I mentioned before in connection with Rilke, the poet Rilke, whom I introduced to you before because he seems to be one of those people who can actually engage with the other and with a different culture in the way described as almost impossible by Edward Said. And I introduced him by two examples. One is the famous series of tapestries from about 1490 in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, known as La Dame à la Licorne. It's 4 times the lady with a unicorn in various scenes, and 5 of the tapestries depict the 5 senses, seeing and feeling, whatever, and the last one has this tent with a motto on it, à mon seul désir. And as I told you, this might mean various things. It might mean the love for God or the love for a husband, but the most probable interpretation giving the European mystical tradition is that of spiritual love, of the highest form of love, which in a way is the love for God, but it is also a love that transcends any definition. And that also embraces, because we know that she was a widow, life and death as a unity. And Rilke wrote about this. He wrote a beautiful little book about it when visiting these tapestries for the first time. That must have been around 1905. And by the way, as occurred to him too, these tapestries are almost from exactly the same date as the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. And think about that, you know, a new era starts, and at the same time somebody makes these incredible tapestries that sort of sum up the artistic and mystical, philosophical traditions of late medieval, early modern Europe. That's quite interesting to think of. Anyhow, Rilke sits there and he engages with these works of art in a way that only he can. He writes not about the lady, not in the first place, but he writes about girls from the Paris Academy of Arts who are sitting on the floor in the museum and they're making sketches of these tapestries. And they do so to get to know this work of art. And he describes the artwork by describing them. He describes them as girls from the French provinces, strangers in Paris. They left their homes and they have this idealism in art, this higher love. And by describing that, he ends with her. And it's a very touching, a very personal way of relating with this. The same way he related to the Gilgamesh epic when he discovered it in a translation. Ich habe an diese wahrhaft gigantischen Büchstücken, Maßen und Gestalten gelebt. I have lived these figures, a very important expression, die zum Größesten gehören, was das zaubernde Wort zu irgendeiner Zeit gegeben hat. What a beautiful language is German, that you can say that. Zaubernde Wort. Isn't that beautiful? Zaubernd. You cannot say that in any language as beautiful as that. I think. It's really beautiful. Well, okay, opinions vary. I think that it is really very beautiful. In any case, think of this. The Gilgamesh epic was not, I mean, for us, I think, I remember the time that in Holland, where I grew up, nobody knew about the Gilgamesh epic. I mean, there were people, you know, in the universities, of course, that knew about it, but the general audience had not heard about the Gilgamesh epic. Sometimes you would come across somebody who maybe had heard about it, but it was really not well known. And I think this is representative of that time. It's really quite recently, maybe the last 2 decades, that Gilgamesh has become more familiar to the general audience. In the time of Rilke, obviously, it was even less known. But he came across it. And although it was from millennia and millennia before his time, and from a culture completely different from his culture, he could immediately relate to it, without hesitation, with a sovereignty of his aesthetic eye. He could immediately talk about it as the zauberende Wort. And he says, in den Fragmenten ist ein wirklich riesiges Geschehen und Dastehen und Fürchten. Und selbst die weiten Textlücken wirken irgendwie konstruktiv. Even the gaps in the text are important. Indem sie die herrlich massiven Bruchflächen auseinanderhalten. Hier ist das Epos der Todesfurcht, entstanden im Unvordenklichen unter Menschen, bei denen zuerst die Trennung von Tod und Leben definitiv und verhängnisvoll geworden war. And this is an estimation of the Gilgamesh epic which remains quite fantastic, because it is indeed an epic about human mortality, but also about the genesis of mortality. It is almost coming from a time that we know so little about, as if indeed it is the first narration, the first human narration of his own mortality. And this is why we have to talk about these things in a more literary and not just a scholarly way, because the way Rilke describes it is infinitely better than any scientific introduction to the Gilgamesh epic, I think. So let's go with him and talk about the Gilgamesh epic. Gilgamesh was a king of the city of Uruk, the oldest city in the world, the oldest, most famous city in the world, where writing was invented, and we talked about that, how incredibly important that is for us. And this incredible city was governed by Gilgamesh, a mythical king who was partly divine and partly human, and therefore mortal. A king of an incredible body, of an incredible beauty, a famous king who had no parallel, but a dictator who maltreated his citizens, who, for instance, took the right to sleep with all the daughters of all families in his city. And the gods even heard about this and came together in council, speaking about the situation in the great city of Uruk, and decided to create another being as a counterweight against Gilgamesh. And they created in the desert a person called Enkidu, a wild man living in the nature. And Enkidu was unaware of himself. It describes the epic in the most beautiful language, that he was running with the gazelles and drinking in the pool with the wild beasts. He was completely hairy and wild, not speaking, he was an animal. One day a hunter, there's the hunter again, sees this fearsome creature, and he reports it back to the city and also to his father, who gives him the advice to bring one of the city's prostitutes to this wild man. And so he does, and Enkidu sleeps with her for 7 days and 7 nights. That was a man. Then after these 7 days, he goes back to his gazelles and back to his wild beasts, with whom he has lived his life until then, and much to his great dismay, they run away from him, because he's not the same again. The gazelles run away, and the wild animals at the pool, they flee when they see him, because he has become a man, and he has become mortal. And he goes back, and the prostitute feeds him bread and makes him drink beer, the symbols of civilization. She shaves him, and he becomes a civilized man. And then she takes him by the hand, and with the hunter, she brings him to the city of Uruk. And then there's this magnificent scene that the walls of Uruk, which have been described in the first lines of the epic as rising high, as having been built by the 7 wise, these walls rise up in the distance, and he sees, we have to imagine the temple tower, the ziggurat, the Tower of Babel. And there is this one line which is essential to the meaning of the whole epic. It says, Enkidu became pale. There's even a whole book about it in French, La pâleur d'Enkidu. What does it mean that Enkidu grew pale upon seeing Uruk? And here I think Rilke was very much on the right track in understanding this epic. Because when Enkidu sees this city, the symbol of human civilization, he realizes that mortality is part of human culture. In nature, he was an animal. And animals have only a present. They don't have a history and they don't have a future. They don't have an awareness of any sense of time. And therefore, they are immortal in a way. By sleeping with a woman and by becoming part of civilization, by becoming aware, by eating the forbidden fruit like Adam and Eve, he becomes a mortal man. And culture is a symbol of this. And this is the problem, I think, that the Gilgamesh epic is addressing. On the one hand, the wonderful culture that man builds, and on the other hand, the mortality of man, death, that is part of that. So he enters the city, and he finds this desperate Gilgamesh, and he confronts him, they wrestle, and they become friends. Gilgamesh becomes a much better king, and they go on adventures together. One of them is to kill the bull of heaven, which the gods sent to them to maybe stop them. But before that, they go to the famous cedar forest. Originally located in Iran, later they thought it was in the Lebanon area. And in this forest there lives a giant by the name of Huawa, later called Humbaba. And he's a force of nature. He's like the Green Knight in Celtic mythology. He is not evil and also not a good force. He is a force. He is nature. Maybe he's a guardian of the cedar forest, and maybe the cedar forest is what keeps the gods immortal. We don't know. It is something very holy and untouchable. Yet Enkidu and Gilgamesh, these wonderful heroes, they go into the forest and they kill Humbaba. And interestingly, Enkidu knows about Humbaba. He knows all kinds of things about him, because he himself comes from this nature state. So they kill Humbaba, although Gilgamesh and Enkidu have all kinds of evil dreams about it, but they do it, and they cut the cedars and they come back to the city of Uruk. And then the gods, as I said, become worried. They send the giant bull of heaven, and that animal too is killed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And Ishtar, the goddess, is complaining about this to the other gods. She has been insulted by Gilgamesh, who didn't go into her seduction. I told you about that. He told her that all her previous lovers had been turned into animals. So he refuses her love, and the gods convene in council again, and they decide to punish Gilgamesh in the most atrocious way they can come up with, and that is to let Enkidu die. And Enkidu dies. He lies on his deathbed, and he curses the hunter, and he curses the prostitute that have brought him to civilization. And then the sun god appears, who is the only sort of acceptable god in the epic. And he says, but Enkidu, because you have met the hunter and the prostitute, you have met Gilgamesh, you had wild adventures in distant lands, you went to the cedar forest, you killed the bull of heaven, you had a friend like no one else. Should you really curse these people? And then he changes his curse into a blessing, and then he dies. And Gilgamesh is without consolation. He walks around the dead body of Enkidu, like, as the epic says, a lioness whose cubs are stolen. And then he sees a worm falling from the nose of Enkidu. It's described very plastically, horribly. And an enormous fear comes over him. This is his moment of paleness. He suddenly realizes that he will die too. And he cannot accept that. So he travels through the deserts, through the mountains, to the end of the world. And everywhere where sort of mythical creatures hold him and ask him what he is doing, he says, my friend, my only friend Enkidu died, and shall I die too like him? So he goes to the end of the world because he knows on an island beyond the normal world there lives the Babylonian hero of the flood, the Babylonian Noah. And he is immortal. And he is an ancestor of Gilgamesh. And he wants to ask his ancestor how he has found immortality. So he comes to the garden of the goddess Siduri at the end of the land. It is called a garden of gemstone trees because it's there where the sun rises. So they imagine that these trees had jewels in them, orange jewels, beautiful colors of the sunrise. And she tells him that it is as good as impossible to cross the outer ocean and the waters of death, but there might be one way, and there's a difficult to understand passage where he finds a trick to cross the waters of death, and he arrives at the island of Utnapishtim, and that is the Babylonian flood hero, and he asks him, how is it possible that you found immortality? And what Utnapishtim describes to him is the Babylonian version of the flood story. That he was the only one who prayed to the gods, who was a pious man, and because of this, one of the gods selected him to survive the flood. And he went to a boat, and he survived the flood, and after the flood he was blessed by the gods together with his wife and put on an island and given immortality. But apparently on the condition that he would live outside the normal world. And after this grey old man, this immortal sage has stopped narrating his story, he looks at Gilgamesh and he says, but who, Gilgamesh, will convene the gods on your behalf to give you immortality? Saying, what kind of record do you have to deserve immortality? Because I prayed every night and day to the gods. And what did you do? You killed their bull of heaven. You killed Humbaba. And then he gives Gilgamesh a test. He has to stay awake for a week. And every day, the wife of Utnapishtim, the flood hero, bakes a bread. And Gilgamesh falls asleep on the first day. And he sleeps until the last day. And he wakes just before the last bread is finished. And the implication seems to be that would he have slept until the last minute of the last day, he would have died. So he wakes up, apparently old. And he has failed the test. Now the wife of the immortal hero, she has a pity for Gilgamesh. And on her urging, he tells Gilgamesh to dive into the ocean and find a certain herb with which he can rejuvenate himself. So he picks this up from the bottom of the ocean and he goes back home. And on stopping and on bathing and putting this little plant on the rim of a well in which he is bathing, a snake creeps up to him, eats the plant, and then sheds its skin, which of course also explains why a snake can rejuvenate. And Gilgamesh has lost everything, even this last little present. And he comes back empty-handed to Uruk, this great city. And then the last lines are a dialogue between Gilgamesh and the shipper, how do you say that, the boatsman, of the immortal flood hero who had brought him back, and who is, of course, like the ear of this flood hero. And he retakes the lines by which the epic has opened, namely the immortal walls of Uruk that are so high, the foundations of which have been laid by the 7 sages. But now it's not the narrator of the epic who says this to us, but it is Gilgamesh himself who says it. He takes this perspective. And I think this is the key to the understanding of the epic. It is his answer to the flood story told by this immortal hero. Maybe I have not found immortality, and maybe I have not prayed to the gods every day and night, and maybe I will die. But I have built immortal walls. And maybe human civilization is full of pestilence and death, and full of evil, and yet it is beautiful, like this painting of Sao Paulo by Anselm Kiefer, entitled Lilith, There She Is Again. This alternative humanity, this proudness in mortality, this leaving paradise voluntarily. This is in essence already in the Gilgamesh epic, and that makes it very powerful. This is, however, not how everybody would look at it. Many people, scientists, Assyriologists, read it as a coming to age. Gilgamesh has to grow up and accept mortality. He has to become part of normal life. He has to find a family, for instance, and he should not stick with Enkidu or whatever. I think all of those interpretations are really too shallow. The story told by this pious immortal hero is not told without value. It gets an answer by Gilgamesh, and the answer is Uruk, the walls of Uruk, immortality. So, this is what we will be talking about for maybe 20 more minutes, and then in the session of next week. Because, as you can imagine, Rilke was not the only one to be hugely impressed by this epic. And mind you, this epic was discovered only in 1871. I must not lie, although I like to do it all the time. Let me see. Yes, 1872. It was identified in 1872 when a person called George Smith was working in the storage rooms of the British Museum, and he identified tablets that to him seemed to be the Babylonian, what he called Chaldean, account of the flood story, of the deluge. And he presented this on December 3rd for the Royal Asiatic Society in London, in the presence of the British Prime Minister and also the famous explorer Stanley, and a lot of famous important people in the UK. And he caused a great surprise. I mean, the audience who heard this story, which was evidently older than the biblical story of the deluge, of course you have to imagine that until then the Bible was simply the oldest document about human history, about our origins. And this guy comes with a cuneiform tablet that is older and has a story that clearly is an original version of the story told in the Bible. Can you imagine what kind of reaction that gave? Goldstone, the Prime Minister of England, he gave a press conference afterwards saying there is no reason for panic. And you know, when politicians say that there's no reason for panic, there usually is quite a lot of reason for panic. And indeed there was, because the primacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which was so important in 19th century Europe, was challenged by this one clay tablet. And George Smith himself too, he realized the great potential of these texts. He says the question has often been asked, what is the origin of the accounts on the antediluvians, a Latin word that means the people from before the flood, with their long lives, so many times greater than the longest span of human life, because they are described in the Bible. Where was paradise, the abode of the first parents of mankind? From whence comes the story of the flood, of the ark, of the birds? The cuneiform inscriptions are now shedding a new light on these questions and supplying material which future scholars will have to work out. And indeed they did, the future scholars, and they did that in a frantic version, in a frantic fashion. Soon, more fragments of the Gilgamesh epic were found. Actually, the Daily Telegraph, which then still was a quality newspaper, gave money to Smith to go back to Mesopotamia, to Iraq, and there to excavate more tablets. And he did. And this was front page news in those days. Assyriology was the new world science. It was where new horizons were discovered. So when the first editions came out, like this one from the 1880s, I mean, people really read it. It was really at the forefront. Now, Paul Hout was already somebody who was linking everything with everything. His edition already tries to make Gilgamesh part of a tapestry of stories. And later scholars who do this even more. And now I have to introduce to you a strange group of people who are all here in Germany, and they are known as the pan-Babylonian movement. These were all people that were born around 1860, and they were, as it were, the second generation of Orientalists in the Wilhelminian Empire. I should stress that because the first generation consisted of very careful philologists who really tried to found their disciplines as really scientific, hardcore philological disciplines, which was very much needed. Because before that, the Orient was only studied as an appendix to the Bible. So this first generation was necessary as an emancipation of Oriental studies. And they did well. The Germans are very important. And I should add that one of the critiques on Edward Said's book is this recent book by Suzanne Marchand on German Orientalism, where she tries to show how much the Germans have done for the study of the ancient Orient. So, that was this first generation, but then there's a second generation, and this second generation wants to ask bigger questions. And they don't want to be philologists, because they feel curfewed being working with texts only, line by line. They want to ask anthropological questions, psychological questions, ethnographic questions to their material. They want to incorporate archaeology. They want to do comparative mythology. They want to do folkloristic studies. They want to combine everything with everything, and they are not afraid of the greatest questions. And they do this with this material, including Gilgamesh. Now, the first one of them was Edward Stucken, and he wrote a series of books called Astralmythen, so astral mythologies, in which he came up with a quite crude theory that explained mythology, Greek mythology, biblical mythology, or Iranian mythology, Germanic mythology, and in the end Babylonian mythology, as a reflection of the heavenly bodies. So, what was the name again? Himmelsbild ist Weltbild was his motto.